Shiv?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Carol.
Shiv, nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. Thanks so much for making the time to come in today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again for being here today. Really appreciate you making the time. We're going to be diving right into a case interview.
Sounds good.
Great. So I'll be reading a prompt from the computer and then we can chat through and solve a business problem together.
Okay.
Today, our client is Private Equitas, which is a global private equity firm based in New York City. They recently acquired a conglomerate media company, and we have been asked to help maximize their investment. The business unit in focus for today is called PrintCo, which is in the business of printing menus for restaurants in the US. They have revenues of $25 million annually. Private Equitas is a bit concerned about the future of PrintCo's industry because sales have been rapidly declining at 10% per year for the past 5 years. As a result, our client has asked us to assess the attractiveness of an adjacent market, electronic restaurant menus. So think menus that you could see on an iPad at a table. PrintCo would design and sell electronic menu interfaces to restaurants, but would not be building the hardware themselves. The key question today is, should PrintCo enter the electronic restaurant menus market?
So if you don't mind, I would love to take a few seconds just to gather my thoughts.
Absolutely, go for it.
So I think when we're addressing this first question of what factors we can consider, there are kind of 4 main factors that I would want to think about. First and foremost, I think we would want to think about profitability. So will it be profitable for PrintCo to enter this market? I think that is the most important question that we'd want to analyze. And then secondarily, I think we should think about, is this market growing? If it's growing, then that makes it a more attractive market. Second, we'd want to think about the competition that is in the market already. So is it going to be more difficult for us to earn a profit because there are already existing players? And then lastly, I'd want to think about barriers to entry. So are there any barriers that would prevent us from getting into the market? Or are there any barriers to entry that once we are in the market would help us make our position more defensible? Are there any others that you think I should be considering?
No, that all makes sense. Really appreciate you laying those out. Would be great to dive a little bit deeper into the first one, profitability, which you highlighted as most important.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think that sort of takes us into our second question. So when I think about profitability, the framework that I usually use to think about it is that we have revenue minus costs equals profit. Since we're kind of moving into the second question here, I think we can focus on revenue first. Is there any information that we have on price?
Yes, so we've done some research and think that we would likely be able to price the e-menus at $40.
And then in terms of volume, are there any assumptions that we would want to use?
So on volume, would be great if you could actually lay out some of the things that you would want to consider to estimate the volume of e-menus in the market per year.
Okay. So if I were to think about the volume of this market, there are kind of a few steps that I would want to go through to get to a volume number. So I think I would start with the total number of restaurants in the US. And I just wanted to confirm that the US is the market that we're thinking about.
Yes, that's correct.
After that, I think I'd want to think about what percentage of restaurants would actually use an e-menu. So that would be kind of step 2. Then I think I'd want to think about, for each of these restaurants, how many menus would they actually use? I would think that not all restaurants would be willing to shift from menu to e-menu in a given year. So we may want to make an assumption about sort of what percentage of restaurants would actually replace their menus in a given year.
Makes sense.
So I think those are kind of the main assumptions that I'd want to make. Should I make my own assumptions or is there any information already?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk through some of them. So in terms of total restaurants in the US, we've done some research and it looks like there's about 600,000 restaurants in the market.
Okay. Do we have a number for what percentage of those would consider using an e-menu?
Yes, so we've done some research here as well, and it looks like, not all restaurants would be interested right away. A lot of them will continue to use their printed menus. So it's a small portion at 5%.
And how many e-menus would each restaurant purchase?
About 30 per restaurant.
Are we assuming that all restaurants would replace their menus with e-menus in a given year?
The frequency of replacement is once every 2 years.
So in a given year, half of the restaurants are replacing. Okay, so 50%. So we start to do the math here. it would be 600,000 restaurants that are across the US. 5% of those are considering using an e-menu. So that takes us to, just doing my math here, 30,000 restaurants that would consider using an e-menu. And then about half of those restaurants are replacing their menus in a given year. So that takes us down further to 15,000 restaurants. And each of those restaurants is going to be purchasing 30 e-menus. So that gets us to 450,000 e-menus across the US. So that kind of gives us our total market volume. And if we go back to our price, we have price of $40 times 450,000 e-menus gets us to a total market size of 18 million, if my math is right. So we have $18 million of total market size. And do we have a sense of maybe a market share that Printco would be trying to obtain?
Yes, so we've done some research and noticed that most of the players in the market are quite small and think that Printco would actually be able to take a good amount of share. We're estimating 20% share.
So 20% share in year one of the $18 million total market would take us to $3.6 million in revenue in the first year. So that gets to our revenue answer, which was our second question. But if we wanted to think a little bit deeper about the profitability, do we have a sense of how much it would cost?
We expect annual costs of $3 million per year.
So we are looking at about $600,000 of profit in the e-menu segment in year one. I think that sort of answers our first two questions. As I move into the third question, are there any other pieces that I missed or questions that I should be answering?
No, so we've talked through the actual revenues and the profits at stake. Would love to understand what additional things would you think about before making a recommendation?
So I think that sort of takes us back to our first question. So if I go back to my initial 4 items that I wanted to consider, we wanted to think about profit, which we've talked about a little bit. Additionally, we talked about growth. So we'd want to know, is this market growing? I think from my experience, it probably is. I would want to think about competition. So are there already any entrenched players in the market that are already delivering e-menus to restaurants? And then lastly, barriers to entry. I would want to think about, are there any factors that are going to make it harder for us to enter the market that we haven't considered? Also, are there any factors that will allow us to defend our position more closely? And an example I could think of is the relationships with the restaurants. Is that going to make it easier for us to maintain the market share that we're estimating at 20%? So I think those are kind of the high-level top priority factors that I would want to consider.
All makes sense. Thank you for talking through those. So the leadership team from both Printco and Private Equitas are here now, and they would love to hear your final recommendation on if they should enter the e-menu market.
So our high-level recommendation is that Printco enter the e-menu market. We've done an initial analysis of the profitability, and we are estimating that Printco will generate around $3.6 million in revenue in year one, which would only cost $3 million. So we're estimating an year one profit or an annual profit of $600,000. I think some next steps that we want to look into are, one, whether or not the market is growing, what the existing competition in the market are, and whether or not there are significant barriers to entry in the market.
Sounds great. Well, that was the case. Thank you so much for solving it and talking through it with me. It was really helpful just to see how you went about a business problem. We'll be reaching out in a couple of days just to talk about the path forward, but appreciate you coming in, and it was so nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Overall, Shiv did a very nice job and was a strong candidate. He would have been passed on to the second round of interviews. A couple things that he did particularly well were that first, he was just very engaged throughout the entire interview process, taking good notes, playing back the initial feedback to make sure that he understood the problem appropriately. He structured his thought process very well and had a good framework for solving the case, laying out important factors and also prioritizing which ones he wanted to focus on. The math was strong across the board. He was accurate in his calculations, but also thoughtful in the setup and very good about communicating the math as he went along. His recommendation was concise, to the point, and also articulated some next steps. Great job and well done, Shiv.